The fracture in the wolf pack. In early spring 2025, a quiet document filed in Washington state accomplished something the Alaskan wilderness never could. It cracked open the wolf pack. For decades, fans of Alaskan Bush People thought they truly understood Bam Bam Brown, the thoughtful one, the introspective son, the brother who questioned things but always stayed loyal. Raised completely off-grid, shaped by firewood, fishing nets, and unbreakable family bonds, he wasn't the loudest Brown, not the most rebellious, not the most dramatic. He was steady. Until that filing surfaced. At first glance, it looked like routine paperwork, a simple business registry update, a slight name variation attached to property records going back decades. But when journalists started following the timeline in late March 2025, a clear pattern emerged. The pattern didn't accuse him of any crime. It revealed something far more personal, a second life that had begun long before the cameras ever arrived. For nearly 30 years, while the world believed Bam Bam was fully committed to the wilderness dream, he had quietly built something else entirely, something structured, something connected to mainstream society rather than isolation. And no one had ever spoken about it publicly. Not Billy Brown while he was alive. Not his siblings. Not production. The silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. When the story first reached the family, it didn't explode into shouting matches. It landed quietly, heavier than anger, more personal than scandal. One sibling reportedly asked him a single question: "Who were you when you weren't with us?" That question hung in the air because the revelation wasn't about betrayal in the classic sense. It was about identity. For 3 decades, while the world saw Bam Bam as completely immersed in the off-grid life, he had been carefully constructing another existence, one rooted in society rather than wilderness. The wolf pack had always preached absolute unity. But unity depends on shared truth. And in 2025, that truth shifted, raised wild before the controversy, before questions about documents and alternate names. There was the myth of the wolf pack. Bam Bam Brown was born into a family that didn't just live differently, they believed they were different. Billy Brown, the patriarch, spoke constantly about freedom, about rejecting society's rules, about raising children who answered to nature instead of institutions. That belief shaped every memory Bam Bam carried from childhood. The wilderness wasn't presented as one possible path. It was presented as destiny. From a very young age, Bam Bam learned that survival was identity. He learned to build shelter before he understood algebra. He learned to track wildlife before he ever stepped into a classroom. Billy's lessons weren't taught as mere skills. They were taught as philosophy. The world beyond the trees was fragile, distracted, dependent. The world inside the wilderness was strong. Bam Bam absorbed that message deeply. Among his siblings, he stood out for his quiet intensity. While some of the Brown children embraced bold personalities and spontaneous humor, Bam Bam was often contemplative. He listened more than he spoke. He watched his father carefully. When Billy addressed the family about legacy, about what it truly meant to be a Brown, Bam Bam's gaze rarely wavered. Billy once told his children, "We do not bend to the world. The world bends around us." For Bam Bam, that statement carried real weight. It became something he carried silently into adulthood. When Alaskan Bush People premiered in the early 2010s, viewers were introduced to a family that appeared untamed and completely unified. The series framed the Browns as a single force standing against modernity, self-sufficient, fiercely loyal, emotionally intertwined. The wolf pack identity wasn't just a catchy marketing phrase. It was a lived narrative. Bam Bam's role in that narrative was layered. He wasn't the loudest brother. He wasn't the most confrontational. Instead, he often served as the thoughtful bridge between extremes. When tensions rose between siblings, he leaned toward calm reasoning. When Billy delivered passionate speeches about heritage, Bam Bam stood beside him with steady affirmation that loyalty built trust with audiences. Fans saw in him a reflection of Billy's philosophy, without the sharp edges. He appeared grounded, protective of his mother, and deeply committed to the family vision. Letters from viewers often praised his maturity. Online discussions described him as the emotional anchor among the brothers. Public perception solidified quickly. Bam Bam was the dependable son, the one who carried both strength and introspection, but loyalty can be layered. Billy's influence was overwhelming. He didn't simply lead his children, he defined the entire framework through which they understood the world. To question that framework would feel like questioning the family itself. Bam Bam never openly challenged his father's authority. Even in moments when the family's circumstances shifted, moving between remote living and more settled locations, he maintained the language of the wilderness. He spoke about freedom. He spoke about independence. He reinforced the mythology that viewers had come to admire, yet there were moments when his expression suggested calculation beneath devotion. As the show gained popularity, the Browns transitioned between states and properties more frequently than the public narrative sometimes acknowledged. Logistics required interaction with legal systems, financial structures, and property regulations. While the family publicly celebrated separation from society, they were still navigating it in necessary ways. Bam Bam noticed that tension early. He watched how contracts were negotiated. He observed how income from the show altered the family's financial landscape. He listened when discussions about long-term stability surfaced behind closed doors. Billy continued to emphasize purity of identity. The wolf pack remained united against external influence. Bam Bam agreed publicly. Privately, questions formed: what happens when the cameras stop rolling? What happens when health falters? What happens when ideology collides with economic reality? He didn't voice those questions loudly. He carried them. After Billy's passing in early 2021, the emotional foundation of the family shifted dramatically. The patriarch who had shaped their entire worldview was gone. Grief settled heavily across the siblings. The show itself took on a more vulnerable tone. During that period, Bam Bam stepped forward quietly. He supported his mother. He mediated disputes. He appeared determined to preserve unity. Viewers saw resilience. They saw a son honoring his father's legacy. What they didn't see was the internal recalibration taking place inside him. Without Billy's commanding presence, the ideology felt less immovable. The wilderness remained important, but the rigidity of the philosophy began to soften. Publicly, Bam Bam continued to speak about the wolf pack as a unified force. He reassured fans that his father's spirit would endure. He emphasized loyalty, strength, and shared purpose. That consistency reinforced trust. Communities that followed the show viewed him as steady during uncertainty. He appeared fully committed to maintaining the myth that had defined them. In interviews, he spoke about honoring his father's dream. He repeated the language of freedom and self-reliance, and yet, beneath that language, a different awareness continued to grow. He understood something few viewers ever considered: the Brown family was no longer just a private unit surviving in isolation. They were a brand. A business. A public narrative subject to scrutiny and expectation. With that awareness came pressure. The stronger the myth became, the harder it felt to complicate it. Bam Bam carried loyalty to Billy not only as affection, but as responsibility. To reveal doubts, or alternative plans, could be interpreted as betrayal of the very identity that had shaped him. So he remained steady. He reinforced the image of the wilderness son. He stood in front of cameras with conviction. He embraced the wolf pack identity in public spaces. Trust deepened. But identity is rarely singular, and as the family's public mythology solidified, so did the quiet realization within Bam Bam that survival might require more than tradition alone. The world beyond the trees wasn't disappearing. It was waiting. The hidden identity. The second life didn't begin as rebellion. It began as doubt. In the mid-1990s, long before television crews followed the Brown family through forests and along rugged coastlines, Bam Bam experienced something he never spoke about publicly. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a realization that settled slowly and refused to leave. The wilderness was powerful. It shaped resilience. It created unity. But it did not guarantee permanence. During one of the family's periodic transitions between remote living and temporary settlements in Washington state, Bam Bam encountered a version of stability that felt unfamiliar: structured neighborhoods, steady employment, predictable income, systems that functioned whether the weather cooperated or not. He didn't envy it. But he noticed it. Billy continued to preach independence from those systems. He believed deeply that reliance on modern structures weakened the human spirit. Bam Bam respected that conviction. He carried it with him, yet beneath that loyalty, a quieter instinct began to form: preparation. At first, the second life was almost invisible. Bam Bam enrolled in community classes under a formal variation of his full legal name: construction management, property fundamentals, basic contract law. Nothing illegal. Nothing deceptive. Simply education pursued without public announcement. He justified it easily to himself: if the family was ever forced to settle permanently, he would know how to build. If property negotiations became necessary, he would understand the language. If income from hunting or filming fluctuated, he could step into structured work. It was contingency planning. But contingency, when nurtured over years, becomes identity. By the early 2000s, he had begun assisting on small renovation projects through acquaintances outside the wilderness circle. Minor investments followed: a modest property purchase, a partnership agreement signed quietly, documents filed under a slightly altered professional presentation of his name, not false, not hidden in shadows. Simply separated from the Wolfpack persona. He told himself the separation protected both worlds. When Alaskan Bush People premiered in the early 2010s, the compartment deepened. The show reinforced a singular narrative: the Brown family existed beyond conventional society, thriving without reliance on systems others depended on. That image became central to the series' appeal. Bam Bam understood immediately: the more powerful the myth became, the less space there would be for nuance. He didn't abandon his second life when filming began. Instead, he refined it. Business communications were handled through separate channels. Meetings were scheduled during production gaps. Partnerships were structured so his involvement didn't appear publicly connected to his television identity. It required discipline. It required emotional division. On camera, he spoke about independence from modern constraints. Off camera, he negotiated renovation contracts and reviewed property documents. The psychological tension was constant, but contained. He loved his family. He believed in much of what Billy had taught him. He wasn't building an escape from them. He was building insurance against uncertainty. Still, there were nights when the contradiction weighed heavily. Was he protecting the wolf pack, or quietly undermining its foundation? He never voiced that question aloud. After Billy's health began to decline in the years before his passing in early 2021, the pressure intensified. The family's financial and emotional future felt fragile. Bam Bam increased his involvement in structured investments during that period. He saw it as responsibility, preparation for a time when the patriarch's authority would no longer shield them from instability. When Billy passed, grief overshadowed everything else. Publicly, Bam Bam leaned into the wilderness identity with renewed intensity. He spoke about legacy, about carrying forward his father's vision, about honoring the Wolfpack code. Privately, he reviewed contracts with sharper focus than ever. The second life was no longer a contingency. It was fully formed. By the early 2020s, he held quiet stakes in several property ventures across Washington state, renovation projects, land development consultations, structured business relationships that bore no resemblance to the rugged isolation viewers associated with him. No criminality existed in any of it. Only contradiction. The first person outside the family to see the full pattern wasn't a journalist chasing scandal. It was a local contractor named Michael Reyes. In early 2025, Michael had worked on a mid-sized renovation project in northern Washington. While reviewing partnership documentation, he noticed the professional name attached to several filings. The surname caught his attention. It wasn't common. Curiosity led him to cross-reference public records. Historical filings stretched back nearly 30 years. Property transactions, education certificates, small business registrations. The timeline aligned precisely with the years Bam Bam appeared on television preaching separation from modern systems. Michael didn't jump to conclusions. He requested clarification. In March 2025, he reached out directly. When Bam Bam agreed to meet him at a modest office space outside town, there was no panic in his demeanor, only fatigue. Michael placed copies of the documents on the table. "These are yours," he said carefully. Bam Bam looked at them without flinching. "Yes." There was no denial, no elaborate explanation, just acknowledgement. Michael's voice remained calm. "Why keep it separate?" Bam Bam leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. "Because people believe in a story," he said quietly. "And sometimes the whole truth makes the story harder to hold." The admission carried no arrogance, only weariness. He explained his motivations plainly: stability, responsibility, insurance against unpredictability. He insisted he had never intended to deceive. He simply believed that blending the two identities publicly would create fractures the family wasn't ready to face. Michael listened. He wasn't an enemy. He wasn't an activist. He was a businessman who understood diversification, but he also understood narrative impact. Once the documentation became known beyond that room, the story would change. When Michael left that meeting, he carried confirmation. When Bam Bam remained seated afterward, he carried the inevitable. For 30 years, he had balanced the wilderness son and the structured investor within himself. He believed he could maintain that balance indefinitely, that compartmentalization was strength, but compartments eventually connect, and in early 2025, the connection became visible. The second life was no longer hypothetical. It was documented. Verifiable. Real. The emotional conflict that had simmered quietly for decades was about to surface publicly, not as scandal, but as revelation, and revelation, even without wrongdoing, can shake a family built on myth to its core. 30 years of compartmentalization. Secrets don't survive for decades without structure. Bam Bam didn't rely on luck to keep his second life separate. He relied on discipline. From the beginning, he understood that survival depended on routine. Every decision had to be intentional. Every overlap between his public identity and his private ventures had to be minimized. He built separation into his daily rhythm. When filming schedules were active, his focus appeared entirely on the family. He was present in the woods. He participated in construction projects. He engaged in on-camera discussions about legacy and independence. There was no visible distraction. He knew that even subtle distance could spark questions among siblings who had grown up reading one another instinctively. When filming paused, his life shifted quietly. Travel was explained as rest or personal time. Meetings were scheduled during periods when the family dispersed to handle their own responsibilities. Emails and documents were maintained through separate accounts under his professional variation of his name. There was nothing illegal about the structure. It was simply compartmentalized with precision. Over time, the separation became a habit. his siblings occasionally noticed his absences, but attributed them to personality differences. Bam Bam had always been more introspective than some of the others. It was easy to assume he needed solitude. After Billy's passing in early 2021, those quiet stretches were interpreted as grief rather than concealment. In truth, those periods were often filled with negotiation and oversight, property assessments, renovation budgets, contract reviews, responsibilities that required him to sit across conference tables instead of chopping wood beside his brothers. The psychological strain didn't erupt in dramatic moments. It accumulated slowly. Family unity had always been framed as absolute. The Wolfpack narrative depended on shared struggle and shared transparency. By maintaining a private professional life, Bam Bam carried knowledge that others did not. He justified it consistently. He told himself he was protecting them from unnecessary worry. He believed that if his ventures failed, he alone would bear the consequences. If they succeeded, the family would benefit indirectly through stability. Still, distance can be sensed even when it isn't explained. One sibling once remarked during a quiet evening, "You disappear sometimes." Bam Bam smiled lightly. "I think too much," he replied. It wasn't entirely false. Paper trails were carefully organized, but not erased. He understood that complete invisibility was neither possible nor necessary. Instead, he relied on the assumption that few people would search deeply enough to connect professional filings in Washington state with the wilderness persona presented on national television. For many years, that assumption held. In 2016, a minor real estate record appeared briefly in a public database under his professional name. An online forum user noticed the similarity to his television identity and posted a speculative comment. The thread gained little attention and dissolved quickly among other discussions. Bam Bam saw it. He did not panic. He adjusted. Future filings were structured through layered entities that remained legally transparent but less immediately recognizable to casual searches. He sought guidance to ensure compliance without visibility. The goal was not deception in a criminal sense. It was narrative insulation. Another close call occurred in 2019 when he spent several consecutive weeks off the family property during what viewers assumed was personal downtime. In reality, he was finalizing terms on a development project. A neighbor near one of the renovation sites recognized him from television and mentioned it casually to a local reporter. The comment never developed into a story. The reporter dismissed it as coincidence. Still, the moment lingered. After Billy's death, scrutiny around the family's finances increased naturally. The public often becomes curious when a patriarch passes and inheritance structures shift. Journalists reviewed property holdings connected directly to the Brown name. They did not initially connect the professional variation used in Bam Bam's ventures, but the gap narrowed. The strain within the family deepened subtly during this period. Grief. Altered communication patterns. Responsibilities redistributed. Decisions about land and future direction required more formal planning than before. Bam Bam participated in those discussions while simultaneously overseeing separate projects his siblings did not fully understand. There were evenings when exhaustion overtook him. He would sit quietly while others debated plans for the family's next move. Inside, he was balancing two strategic maps, one rooted in wilderness continuity, the other anchored in structured development. He never voiced frustration. He internalized it. By late 2024, public access to digital records had become more streamlined. Advocacy groups and independent researchers found it easier to cross-reference property transactions and corporate filings. The separation that once relied on obscurity began to feel thinner. Bam Bam sensed it. He considered disclosure more seriously than ever before. He weighed the potential relief of transparency against the potential fracture of the Wolfpack narrative. The family's identity had been shaped by Billy's conviction. To reveal long-standing parallel investments might feel like undermining that legacy. He hesitated. In private moments, he questioned whether silence had become heavier than truth. 30 years of compartmentalization had preserved unity outwardly, but it had also built invisible walls within him. The near exposures in recent years didn't frighten him because of legal risk. They unsettled him because they signaled inevitability. The paper trail existed. The documentation was legitimate. If someone followed it far enough, they would arrive at the same conclusion. He was not only a wilderness son. He was a man who had navigated two systems at once. By the time early 2025 arrived, the structure that had protected his dual identity for decades began to strain. Public curiosity intensified. Records were reviewed with sharper eyes. For 30 years, compartmentalization had been his shield. Now it was becoming his burden. The separation had preserved the myth, but it had also delayed a reckoning that was slowly approaching. When the truth surfaced, the truth didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived with a link. In early April 2025, an entertainment outlet published a detailed feature outlining Bam Bam Brown's long-standing involvement in property development and structured investments in Washington state. The tone was restrained. The documentation was precise. The timeline stretched back nearly 3 decades. By midday, the story was circulating widely. Inside the family, the reaction wasn't explosive at first. It was quiet, heavy. Bam Bam received the first call from a producer associated with Alaskan Bush People before noon. "We need clarity," the voice said carefully. "This is gaining attention." He answered evenly, "I will give it." But clarity inside the family came first. The siblings gathered privately that evening. No cameras. No public statements. Only the wolf pack seated around a familiar table, reading words that reframed their shared history. One brother spoke first, "So it's all true." Bam Bam did not look away. Yes. There was no attempt to minimize the timeline, no denial of the documentation. He acknowledged the investments, the partnerships, the education pursued quietly decades earlier. "What else do we not know?" another sibling asked, the question landing sharper than intended. The room held its breath. "That's it," he said. "I built stability outside this life. I did not leave this life." The distinction mattered to him. To some of them, it did not. For years, the wolf pack identity had been reinforced as singular. They had faced criticism from outsiders together. They had defended their way of life together. Now one member's quiet parallel existence forced them to reconsider how unified that reality truly was. Grief resurfaced unexpectedly. Billy's absence felt larger in that moment. He had been the architect of their philosophy. Would he have approved? Would he have felt betrayed? No one could answer that. One sister's voice softened, "You should have trusted us." Bam Bam's response came slowly, "I was trying to protect us." Production fallout followed quickly. Network representatives requested meetings. Contracts were reviewed. Public relations teams prepared statements emphasizing that no legal violations had occurred and that cast members were not required to disclose unrelated business ventures. Still, perception shifted. The show had long leaned into the mythology of separation from modern systems. Viewers debated whether that mythology had been compromised. Comment sections filled with divided opinions. Some praised Bam Bam for foresight and financial intelligence. Others accused him of quietly undermining the authenticity that defined the series. Behind the scenes, tension settled unevenly. One brother struggled openly with the revelation. He interpreted it as a fracture in shared struggle. "We were out there building cabins," he said quietly during a private exchange. "And you were building something else." Bam Bam did not argue. "I was building for all of us," he replied. Whether that intention absolved the secrecy remained unclear. Conversations with their mother were more measured but deeply emotional. She asked practical questions about risk and exposure. She asked whether the family name would suffer lasting damage. Beneath her composure lay disappointment that such a significant chapter had unfolded without full transparency. The wolf pack had always marketed unity as strength. Now unity required renegotiation. Publicly, Bam Bam issued a calm statement in mid-April 2025. He acknowledged the dual path. He framed it as preparation for uncertainty. He emphasized that his commitment to family and heritage had never wavered. Privately, the fracture felt more complicated. Trust is not broken only by lies. It can strain under omission. In the weeks that followed, filming schedules were adjusted. Conversations on set carried a new edge. The myth of complete separation from modern systems had thinned. Some siblings gradually leaned toward understanding. They recognized the unpredictability of television and the necessity of long-term planning. Others needed more time. The most painful realization for Bam Bam was not public criticism. It was the shift in how his brothers looked at him, not with hatred, not with rage, but with recalibrated awareness that he was no longer simply the wilderness philosopher among them. He was a strategist who had walked ahead quietly. By late spring 2025, the storm had not destroyed the wolf pack. But it had altered its landscape, and landscapes, once reshaped, never returned to their original form. After the wild by the summer of 2025, the noise had softened. The headlines that once carried urgency now felt distant. Comment sections slowed. The initial shock gave way to reflection. There were no criminal investigations. No contracts were terminated. No dramatic exit from the series occurred. The consequences were quieter. They were relational. Within the family, conversations became more deliberate. The wolf pack did not dissolve, but it changed. Unity was no longer assumed. It was negotiated. Trust was not automatic. It was rebuilt through smaller, honest exchanges. Bam Bam did not retreat from responsibility. He reduced the visibility of his business involvement and clarified its structure openly with his siblings. Documents that once lived in private files were now discussed across kitchen tables. Transparency replaced insulation. Some brothers accepted the explanation quickly. They understood the instinct to prepare for uncertainty. They had witnessed firsthand how fragile income from hunting and television could be. Others carried a deeper sense of disruption. To them, the myth of absolute separation from modern systems had been sacred. The loss of that myth felt personal. Redemption did not come through grand gestures. It emerged through consistency. Bam Bam remained present during family projects. He continued participating in discussions about land, legacy, and future direction. He did not attempt to justify every past decision. He acknowledged the weight of silence. One evening, months after the revelation, a sibling asked him quietly, "Do you regret it?" He took his time before answering. "I regret not sharing it sooner," he said. "I do not regret building it." That distinction defined his new reality. Public perception shifted, but did not collapse. Some viewers expressed renewed respect, seeing him as pragmatic rather than contradictory. Others remained skeptical, feeling that the series had presented an image too simple for the truth it now carried. Legacy rarely survives untouched by complexity. For years, Bam Bam had been viewed as the thoughtful wilderness son who embodied his father's philosophy without deviation. Now he stood as something more layered, a man shaped by ideology who also recognized the necessity of adaptation. A son loyal to his father's vision, who quietly prepared for a world that vision did not fully address. Identity, he learned, is not a single thread. It is a weave. The wilderness taught him resilience. The structured world taught him foresight. Both shaped him. Both were real. The tension came from believing they could never coexist openly. After the storm of revelation passed, what remained was not a fractured family, but a recalibrated one. The wolf pack continued, no longer anchored to illusion, but to a more complex truth. Bam Bam's legacy now carries duality. He is neither purely myth nor purely strategist. He is a man who tried to protect his family from uncertainty in the only way he knew how. He believed silence was strength. He discovered that transparency, though painful, can be steadier ground. The wild did not disappear from his life, but it no longer defines him entirely, and perhaps that is the truest evolution of all. For 30 years, Bam Bam Brown balanced two worlds in silence. Now the truth stands in the open, raw and complicated. Was he protecting his family's future, or quietly rewriting the Wolfpack legacy? Tell us what you think below, and if you want more deep stories about the hidden lives behind your favorite reality stars, make sure you subscribe and stay with us for what comes next.